All right, there are a few people still trickling in, but we are so excited that all of you are here. And we're really excited about the interest in this webinar as well. My name is Zoe Siegel. I am the Director of Climate Resilience here at Greenbelt Alliance. And in light of our, new or not so new anymore digital world, this is a series highlighting local climate leaders in the Bay Area on issues making our world more resilient. In case this is your first time joining us, Greenbelt Alliance is a nonprofit based here in the Bay Area, and our mission is to educate, advocate, and collaborate to make the Bay Area's lands and communities more resilient to a changing climate. We've recently launched a new strategic plan focused on data-driven and innovative land use policy solutions, and really focused on fostering much needed regional collaboration to plan and invest in equitable, resilient communities. But this work isn't new to us. For over 60 years, Greenbelt Alliance has stewarded the Bay Area's natural landscapes while promoting the growth needed for thriving communities. As a result, almost 3.3 million acres of the Bay Area's 9 counties are protected open spaces. Now, the Bay Area needs critical help as our climate changes dramatically. While a lot of our strategic plan really focuses on land use solutions for adaptation, like how we are preparing communities for the impending climate threats like fire and flooding, we're also really focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and utilizing nature-based solutions to sequester carbon from our atmosphere. According to UN climate scientists, we need to cut global emissions in half and draw down 1 trillion tons of warming pollutants that have already dumped into the atmosphere to have any hopes of securing a climate-safe future. Capturing carbon from the air through soils management, vegetation, and habitat management, and climate-smart habitat restoration is really a key part of the climate solutions that we need to implement, and involve many other benefits, including enhanced resilience, food and water security, biodiversity, and the creation of many green jobs. According to our friends and partners at Climate Safe California, by 2030, we need to achieve 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below the 1990 greenhouse gas levels, and net negative emissions, which means that we need to start drawing down so that sequestration is greater than emissions. We want to get to 100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually by 2030, which is well beyond what we are doing today. And we need to do this in a way that creates equity, ensuring that low income and communities of color really are prioritized in this process. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We are thrilled to be joined by Wendy Millett, the ranch director of Tomcat Ranch, and Tori Estrada, the executive director of the Carbon Cycle Institute. And if you could both join me right now, that would be lovely. Hello. For more than 20 years, Wendy has worked to bridge a love of conservation and working landscapes with practical economic solutions and effective partnerships. At the Carbon Cycle Institute, Tori directs its policy and climate justice work. Tori has worked with the nonprofit, community-based, and public institutions to advance solutions to social and environmental justice, climate and environmental issues. Their full bios can be found on our Eventbrite page. Together today, we're going to learn about the principles of regenerative agriculture and the processes for how water, carbon, and our local food systems are connected before diving into the policy opportunities and ways these methods are being implemented in the Bay Area. For many of you, this may be your first time learning about carbon sequestration, so we thought it would be helpful to watch a very short video clip explaining the process so that we can dive into the details. Afterwards, we'll have short presentations from both Wendy and Tori before opening it up into a conversation that we hope you can all take part in. There will be time at the end for a Q&A, so please add your questions to the Q&A box. If you have any questions during the presentations, please feel free to chat them. And with that, I will start our very short video.
Soil is a living miracle. In one handful of soil, there are more organisms than there are humans on Earth. And we are only beginning to understand this vast network of beings right beneath our feet. We rely on healthy soil for 95% of what we eat. Yet, we take it for granted. Thousands of years of plowing, deforestation, and erosion have left our soils in dire shape. And we're accelerating the loss of this essential resource. But there's a lot more to the story. When soil is damaged, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this has had serious consequences for the climate. Too much carbon in the atmosphere is causing the Earth to overheat. That excess carbon is also acidifying our oceans, threatening marine life. Meanwhile, there's not enough carbon where it once was, in the soil. In fact, many of the world's cultivated soils have lost more than 50% of their original carbon stocks. But there's actually some good news. We now know how to put carbon back in the soil where it belongs. Plants capture carbon dioxide in their leaves and pump the carbon down through their roots to feed hungry microorganisms living in the soil. Now, what had been atmospheric carbon, a problem, becomes soil carbon, a solution. Practices like keeping soil covered with plants, increasing crop diversity, composting, and carefully planned grazing are proven ways to put carbon back into the soil. Carbon-rich soils act like giant sponges, absorbing water during floods and providing it to plants in times of drought. And adding carbon to soil makes the land much more productive. The French government recognizes this and is calling on all countries to join them in increasing soil carbon by 0.4% each year. If every nation were to reach this ambitious but achievable goal, we could store 75% of global annual greenhouse gas emissions, enough to make a real difference to our planet's future well-being. Of course, we still need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions, but we don't need to develop expensive or risky technologies. Instead, what we need is a lot more photosynthesis. Climate change can be overwhelming, yet there is real hope. Healthy soil can be a major sink for carbon. But this fact hasn't been well known until now. Because now we know a soil solution is right beneath our feet.
All right. Well, now that we all have a nice overview of how carbon sequestration works, I will turn it over to Wendy Millett.
Thank you, and hi everybody. Let me get 1 second to get set up here.
No worries. And yes, I will share the video in the chat if anybody wants to rewatch it.
Okay, I think we got it all going. Is that working?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So hi everybody. I'm excited to share and follow up off that video because that video I love Michael Pollan's voice, and I love the whole story of photosynthesis, which is where I got really excited about this work. I've been at Tomcat about 8 years. I was in conservation at the Nature Conservancy and land conservation before that. But I've been always really passionate about how do we restore landscapes And the regenerative agriculture opportunity is really exciting to me. And so I'm going to walk you through a little bit why that is, and hopefully this will be helpful, and then I'll hand it over to Tori. So a little bit about what regenerative agriculture is. If it's new to you, there's a lot of definitions. If you Google it right now, you will see. Point Blue Conservation Science is the science group that works here at the ranch to document the work that we're doing with our agricultural practices. And so together with them, we've worked out a definition that includes food and economies, soil fertility, biodiversity, water cycling, water quality, climate stability. And so we kind of have all those things in one place definition. The origins of regenerative agriculture, hopefully all of you, if you've been following the regenerative agriculture trajectory, understand that the indigenous and traditional practices around the world really have been operating in an agricultural connection with land in a way that is very much about mimicking nature and following the practices of how nature would have done things. And that's really the basis for regenerative agriculture and modeled through indigenous practices. So we all have lots to learn and lots of thanks to give to indigenous peoples for this practice. It kind of comes down to 6 core principles. This actually is an image from General Mills, which I highlighted because it's interesting to know, if you think regenerative ag is a niche, that it's gotten to be more and more mainstream these days. Nestle has just announced they've got something, General Mills. Patagonia's been on the regenerative conversation, for quite a while. And here's some of the core principles. It's really about understanding the context of your land, minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing diversity in your crop or your land cover, keeping the soil covered at all times, because you just saw from Michael Pollan, or heard about the importance of the green plants for photosynthesis. Again, photosynthesis and maintaining living root year round. And then integrating livestock, because livestock provides this wonderful nutrient feed for the soil. So the way that we like to think about it here at Tomcat Ranch, and we're an 1,800 acre working cattle operation, but as I said, with the scientist here helping us learn from our practices. And we always describe the co-benefits of these regenerative practices, because as I pointed out in the definition, really focused on how does it all fit together: biodiversity, water quality, food systems, racial and social justice, climate, health. It seems too good to be true. I get it. And I have to say, thanks to getting to see regenerative practitioners around the world, it actually is real. It's just incredible the amount of benefit that we can actually have in an agriculture that really focuses on building soil health and on activating photosynthesis. So I jumped to this slide just as an example of how the system works. You see I highlighted in red that the photosynthesis really drives the whole system. And photosynthesis is really where carbon is coming down from the air into the ground, through the plants, through the root systems, and then this remarkable dance of life that happens under the ground, where the roots and the bacteria and fungi and biology in the soil is actually exchanging sugars, carbon for sugars, for nutrients, and the animals then, whether it's cattle or any series of animals, are providing the nutrients for the soil biology. So it's a fascinating dance of life, and that's really what regenerative agriculture is trying to bring, I think, back into our agricultural systems, because we've really lost that in the sort of current mode of industrial mechanized agriculture. So jumping along to a few of the benefits, I'm going to try and show you this.
Difficult to realize the difference in rainfall runoff between a continuously grazed pasture versus a rotationally grazed pasture. NRCS uses a rainfall simulator to demonstrate the effects of infiltration versus runoff on pasture surfaces. One represents continuous overstocked and overgrazed pasture. The other represents a rotationally grazed and rested pasture. All rainfall runoff is funneled into a collection jug on the front of the demonstration table. This allows us to visually compare both the volume and clarity of the runoff. By the end of the demonstration, it's amazing to see how much more runoff occurs on the continuous overgrazed pasture versus the well-rested rotationally grazed pasture. Here you can see how much more water actually soaks in and absorbed under the rotationally grazed well-rested pasture and how much more water actually runs off the continuous grazed pasture.
So I love that. And I've seen this happen on ranches. They love to, the regenerative ag folks love to do this video. It's called the slake test. And they love to do this practice on their ranches to show how much the living plants can hold water and be absorbed into the soil, and then help address things like fire and flood and drought and some of these massive challenges that we've had in our world today, in some part because our water cycles are not functioning properly. And so helping to increase soil health, interestingly, becomes one of the core priorities to help address fire, flood, and drought, because in improving our soil health, we improve the soil's ability to hold water, and then therefore, you know, grow more plants, absorb more water during flood, and keep water temperatures down, which will help reduce all of these risks. Another thing that we're excited about in regenerative agriculture is on the human health side, not only on the side of healthy soil will lead to healthier food, but also healthy soil means you don't need pesticides and fertilizers the way that is common in agriculture these days, because there's native plants and native bugs that will actually eat invasive bugs. And so we're finding that regenerative programs, agriculture programs, don't need the amount of fertilizer. And in most cases, it's just they can drop those. And that's really a key piece of improving our overall system, including water quality. Regenerative agriculture is also about generating more profit. And sometimes that includes increasing income. A lot of time that starts with reducing costs, talking about costs for inputs. And by inputs in agriculture, we're talking about, as I said, pesticides, fertilizers, management cost decrease, increasing resilience. And then the income side, healthier soil leads to healthier food, premium products, increasing rates of even putting your animals, it's called stocking rate, on the land, but always in this accord of animals that move around the land as wild herds would. They're always moving, they're never staying in one place. So there's quite a lot of proof points. American Farmland Trust, you may well know, and they've got some wonderful proof points, and including the economics, because then one of the many challenges that we hear in regenerative agriculture from farmers and ranchers is, I can't change, it's too expensive. And so helping to understand what the economics are of these cases. We've profiled a lot of ranchers. American Farmland Trust is profiling a lot of farmers. The success stories are inspiring. And so here's just a couple, but definitely go and check out AFT's page if you want to learn more. Here's a really exciting one from Tomcat. So we've been managing in a regenerative fashion for about 10 years. Point Blue Conservation Science has been here with us for that whole time. And you can see here, we've been tracking all annual grasses, perennial grasses, forbs, invasive weeds. And over that time, this graph is just to show the improvements that we're seeing. Annual grasses are going down, which is great. And perennial grasses and forbs, things that we actually do want to see, are going up. Bare ground is going down, which is great as we try to work on our soil health. And then we've also gotten to see a wonderful amount of wildlife on the property coexisting with our grazing program. You know, when you're moving the animals always around the land, they're not staying in one place. And there's lots of the ranch that stays pretty wild and free most of the time because the cattle might be in a certain area of the ranch for a couple of days only before they move to another area. And so we've seen those baby mountain lions were drinking out of our water tank when the cattle weren't there. And we've seen all kinds of bird species that are regularly monitored at the ranch. We've also seen a great improvement in our native perennial grasses. This shows the trajectory from 2011 to 2018. The way that you talk about regenerative agriculture and grazing is you break up the ranch into lots of pastures. There's not literally fences around all of those, but we use electric fencing to help us consolidate the cattle in a certain area so that when we want them to move, we can. So we have these sort of mock areas that are pastures for the purposes of our monitoring. And you can see that over that time, we've got an increase of native perennials in 70 of the 75 pastures. That doesn't mean that it's 100% native perennial. We have a 20% target for each of those pastures. And that was set by Point Blue, our conservation partners for us. And the change was only from grazing and changing the timing of our grazing. So we haven't planted seeds, although now we're doing some experiments with some seeding. But the initial experiment we did is just with the grazing to see if grazing could really be beneficial to our native perennials. As you probably know, the native perennials have much deeper root systems. So one of the main reasons we prioritized that was obviously for biodiversity, what's native to California, but then for that soil benefit that comes from these deeper root systemed plants. We've also been able to increase resilience through our soil work. So a few measures that Point Blue does for us is around soil compaction, the rate of the water infiltrating into the soil, and the carbon in the soil. And so in all of those cases, and this is all on the Tomcat Ranch website if you want to do a deep dive to see more about what we're seeing. But on the compaction side, working towards making sure that the ground is not compacted because that'll reduce water infiltration. On the water infiltration side, it gets a measurement to see how quickly or slowly the water seeps into the ground. Critical for our ability to hold water, to be resilient from drought. We've seen water is consistently in our creek flowing. It used to run dry, but it's been running, even through these last drought years, it's been running year round because we've just been holding more water on the ranch. And then our soil carbon has been increasing even during the drought, which is pretty incredible because carbon needs water to really increase. And we have had a bunch of years of drought and that's made it challenging, but even so, we're seeing an increase in many of our monitoring sites. So a little bit more about the practices for regenerative agriculture, because I've mostly just been showing you some slides on ranching, but on the agriculture side, just to give you a sense, planned grazing, which is PG here, is just one of the tools. Nutrient management, cover crops is the CC, and no-till are among the tools that might be used in a more crop-intensive kind of landscape. This slide is from the Soil Health Institute, so showing the benefits of accruing those practices together. Carbon and carbon farm plans, I'm going to bump right over that one because Tori is going to no doubt talk about that, but the opportunity that we can actually increase the soil organic matter and in doing so increase carbon stored in our soils is tremendous possibility and a huge focus for what this whole Working Lands program and land-based solutions for climate's all about. So I think just sort of getting towards a wrap up here, the key takeaway, I think, if you're new to this regenerative agriculture thing, is thinking about photosynthesis and how we increase photosynthesis on all of the lands And when we do that, we're going to improve our soil organic matter. That's going to hold more water capacity. And then you can see it's a virtual cycle. And when we do those things, we're going to get economic sustainability and food security. And we're going to get closer to reaching our climate goal, protect our biodiversity. So it's very much about looking at nature as a system, and agriculture as part of a living system. And that's the exciting thing for me about regenerative agriculture, moving towards that trend. It feels like, whether it's called regenerative agriculture, climate smart agriculture, there's quite a lot of names you'll hear when you get into this space, but I'm excited to share what we're learning, and happy to answer questions. So I'm going to pause there and turn it over to Tori.
All right, thank you, Wendy. Tori, take it away.
Thanks. Let me get my slides up here. All right. I'm assuming everybody can see that.
Yep.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. It was a great intro to what I'm going to talk about. And I do want to say this is, I feel like at a local level, we should have like continuing education, because this is like, should be a semester-long conversation. And we certainly know a lot of science and what drives this, but we're also learning a lot on the landscape. And I think as someone considers himself an ecologist, I think in terms of land management, we're always learning. And I think that's the opportunity, is to be more actively engaged in our landscapes, and to start to really figure out the context of the type of management we can do and the kind of changes we want to see on the land. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some policy and implementation opportunities, particularly in the Bay Area, both focused on regenerative agriculture, but also building resilience in our working lands. As the video rightfully talked about, we feel it's important, if we're going to solve a problem, to really understand the system that we're working in. So if we're talking about climate change and carbon, we're talking about the carbon cycle. And we've been rightfully focused on this area where we're taking fossil carbon in our industrial systems and pumping it into the atmosphere. And that's important to really focus on emissions reductions. But there are other pieces of the carbon cycle that are in play here. The biggest, actually much bigger than the atmosphere, is the ocean carbon pool. So, you know, carbon's finite, and it moves and changes forms as it cycles through, and that's what it's doing. It's cycling through these systems. Right now, oceans are taking actually the majority of the excess carbon that we're putting in the atmosphere. And unfortunately, as Michael Pollan's narration said, that's actually creating negative impacts on the ocean acidification and the like. The interesting part, and we like to say this is the longest R&D project on the planet, is we have this system that we've been alluding to, which is the terrestrial system, and the vegetation that's connected to it is actually also a huge reservoir for carbon. And when we put carbon, as Wendy talked about, into our soil and vegetation system, it actually has a positive benefit for us and for the planet. And I want to remind ourselves, when as Michael Pollan said, the soil underneath our feet feeds us, and we don't look at that, but we are really dependent as a species, not only for converting that photosynthetic carbon from the atmosphere into carbohydrates, into soil fertility and biodiversity, so that the energy from the sun through plants actually drives the biodiversity on the planet. That's a fundamental truth. And so we need to really think about that it's playing that really critical role, in addition to providing the oxygen we need as well. So this focus we're going to have today on the soil system, I think it's really important. But again, it's not a panacea, and it doesn't replace our focus on emissions, ocean preservation. These things need to be nested, at least in my opinion. This is a sort of system approach that I think we need to be thinking about moving forward. Just to also back what the video talked about, so folks will notice this CO2 graph. This is the keeling curve. So we, since 1950s. We've been monitoring the CO2 rise, which has been driving our alarm in response to climate change. But we've also had a corresponding loss of soil organic carbon in our natural working lands. So certainly, as Michael Pollan talked about, the loss of carbon from our soils is through our agricultural systems, particularly our industrialized systems, has really contributed part of that. But to really be clear, that soil carbon loss was due to management. So it's active human management that's driving that. And so part of the proposition is actually by improving that management, could we actually start to reverse that trend, either stop that trend or potentially drive it down? So here's one thing I think it's really important on the policy side that I feel, I could say this as an American who's looked at this, is I feel like our carbon policy until recent is kind of lagging. And I want to explain this. This is actual paper that came out after the Paris Accord, where we're sort of European Union was gaming out sort of how we're going to reach the Paris guidelines and goals. And there are 3 lines here, really simple. The red line is our CO2 emissions, which obviously need to go down. The gray line is emissions from changing land use. So you can think about converting forest into agriculture. And the blue line is actually sequestered carbon. So carbon that's actually removed from the atmosphere. So when the EU thought about this, it was a portfolio of options here. We have to reduce our emissions. To meet Paris, we have to cut our emissions in half every decade to reach that goal. We also need to reduce emissions coming from land use, and we also need to take up carbon from the atmosphere. These are all 3 nested, and the policy is really undergirded by this approach. If we took off carbon removal out of this equation, the resulting math is that we would have to cut emissions in half every 5 years, which most people feel is close to impossible. So this, and we can argue about some of the subtleties of this, but the point is that in the US context, and I think the California context, we need to be thinking about carbon removal as part of our policy. And again, I want to say this very clearly, carbon sequestration does not remove the requirement for carbon emissions reduction or CO2 emissions reduction. It isn't an either or. It isn't intended to replace it. It's complementary. So I just want to kind of put that out there. That's an assumption our work works from, is that carbon removal, particularly from working lands, plays an important synergistic role as we think about policy to address climate change. And this is reflected, actually, for those that don't know, carbon sequestration or carbon removal from our natural working lands is actually the 5th pillar of California's climate policy. A lot of people don't know that. It's actually the most underdeveloped portion of our policy, but it's there. So particularly as we think about new executive order coming from Newsom and a push for carbon neutrality by either 2045 or 2030, that's going to increase the need for each one of these 5 pillars to do the work it's going to do. So carbon sequestration in the land base plays a really important role in thinking about climate mitigation adaptation in California. And just so you know, with it being the 5th pillar, like other sectors like transportation and energy, where we have a statewide plan, we have a goal for reduction and we have strategies for implementation. The natural working land sector has been working on this as well. Unfortunately, too slowly, in my opinion. So by the end of 2021, next year, we will finally have the first scoping plan for the state of California, which will set an annual and 2030 and 2040 goal for greenhouse gas emissions reductions and carbon sequestration as a statewide goal, which will include working lands. So that's something, if you are engaged in policy, I think this is a fairly important document, because I think this will start to provide some of the higher level goals and potential funding needed to kind of support this, these goals that are emerging. And I just want to provide some context too. It isn't that there isn't currently funding for what Wendy was talking about for land management. There are currently several pots of funding that existing partners are using to work with land managers, in this case ranchers and farmers, to plan and implement on-farm conservation projects that have carbon sequestration and other ecosystem benefits. And these are just a quick review of those. Now, the funding for these programs pale in significance to the other climate sectors. They're severely underfunded, but they do exist, and there are projects that are going on. And I do want to mention that through the USDA Farm Bill and our Natural Resources Conservation Service, there's existing federal money actually that supports many of the practices that Wendy talked about in her slide. So we do have federal funding, which I think now will actually flow even more under a new administration. And we have emerging state funding to fill some of the gaps there. Not sufficient, but there are resources, at least a foundation for that work. And I wanted to talk, just an example today, just talk a little bit as a kind of a vignette into this, looking at Sonoma County, where I'm based. So in Sonoma County, right now are resource conservation districts, which have been around, most of them since the 1940s, who work with farmers to identify conservation practices to improve soil, biodiversity, and other important ecological outputs. Have been working with producers on specific plans to draw down carbon. So currently there are 16 carbon farm plans that have been developed across a range of farming and ranching activities, including vineyards. Actually, the North Coast has a soil health hub, which is basically a partnership of resource agencies that come together to plan, educate, plan, and implement projects at scale. And again, there are state funded projects, demonstration projects that are happening in this county. Every county has some level of activity going on. So again, this, in some ways, regenerative agriculture is new, but projects are actually ongoing. There are existing work happening in your backyard. So just a shout out to connect to that, because there is ongoing work happening on the ground. And this is a map of one of the carbon farm plans in West Sonoma County. It's actually a dairy. This represents a carbon farm plan, and it's essentially, for those that do work in the energy sector, it's similar to a building energy audit. Our partners go out and they actually work with the farmer to identify all opportunities for greenhouse gas reduction and carbon sequestration. This plan is developed with specific strategies, and it's implemented over time as resources and technical assistance are available. So if you look at the specific plan, you could see on the left here the number of practices that were identified on this dairy. And then using quantification platform that's actually been approved by the state of California Air Resources Board for climate mitigation, we can actually calculate out the annual and year 20, 30, even longer carbon sequestration from these practices. So different practices have different timelines. If we're thinking about, reforesting parts of our ag land, as we know, trees grow, they sequester carbon both below ground and above ground. So the amount of carbon stored in these systems actually accrues over time. So this gives you an example of what one dairy, in Sonoma County can potentially do at full build out. Just as this an example of the riparian restoration, the reason why I put that up there is for a number of reasons beyond the carbon benefit. As Wendy suggested, most of these practices have multiple benefits. So in this case, this is addressing biodiversity and habitat, particularly for salmonids and other riparian systems. And it's actually engaging the community in the restoration of its backyard. So in this case, school kids, local nonprofits, and then a whole labor force that supports the planning and implementation of these projects at scale. So again, if this work's done well, it's not something that's sort of out there. It's sort of something that most local folks can connect with on the ground. I also want to mention, as I said, as alluded to in the carbon farm plan I talked about, there's a platform, at least one platform, this is the one that's used in the state of California to quantify the carbon and climate benefits of the projects it's investing in, Comet Planner, we use this as a tool to help farmers and planners identify practices and then what the potential carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas benefits. So this was developed by the USDA NRCS with Colorado State. Colorado State actually does the quantification for land-based emissions for the US government for the IPCC. And so we downscaled this, essentially what is a model, to start to quantify the greenhouse gas benefits of land-based practices. So the state of California has its own version of this for different farming types, and it's used on the ground to help support the quantification. One thing I will say is where we have better local data, so on compost application as an example of a practice, we actually have better local data, and we always use the best available data we have to quantify the carbon benefit. Just want to mention too, as we increase carbon in the soil, we actually hold more water, as the video Wendy showed that. So on this dairy, we can see, over a 20-year period with the increasing carbon, the water benefit. So that's helpful for ranchers from an operational point of view, but also makes them more resilient as we have drier conditions, but also when we're getting more water in short periods of time, the soil actually can hold that water and not have it run off. And this is just an example. The carbon farm planning or regenerative ag works across all types of agriculture. So there's work happening on wineries, different set of practices per se, but still the same concept, identifying all those ways to sequester carbon in those systems. So just so you get a sense of comparability in terms of the context of local climate reduction plans, these 16 plans in Sonoma, if fully implemented at year 20, would amount to about 256,000 metric tons of COE. That's almost equivalent to, actually exceeds the current amount of ag emissions in Sonoma County. So you can begin to see some of the scale and substantive role that regenerative ag can play in climate mitigation. Now, obviously, we have to be able to have the resources to implement this level, but it provides an opportunity to sort of get to have real climate mitigation opportunity. Gives you a sense of those 16 plans and the range of systems and practices that would be employed, from doing agroforestry or reforesting some of our ag lands to managing croplands, that's when you talked about, for less soil disturbance and carbon capture, and also managing our rangelands, our grazing, range planning to improve carbon capture in those systems. And all this, at least for the work that we're engaged in, is actually tracked at a very specific level. So the resource conservation districts actually have their own online database where they track projects, costs, partners, and also metrics for outcomes. So in this case, Ocean Breeze, we can actually, this is publicly available. We can understand the scale of the project and also dial in sort of the practices, the acres employed, and the metric tons of carbon, and also other ecosystem benefits. So we can actually track this stuff at a very, finite level. So the question becomes, as we move from think about farms, how do we begin to think about counties and climate action plans? And I think we can start to estimate the potential of scaling these practices at a county-wide or a watershed level. And we've been doing a little bit of this work, so I just wanted to give you one example, the work that we are doing in Santa Clara County, where we can actually look at grazing land and think about a practice like compost application, and we can begin to do analysis at scale. So this map shows you all the grazing land in Santa Clara County, and then we could use different criteria to start to identify where those opportunities might be to put compost. So we can constrain our analysis by ecological factors, like we don't want to put compost on standing native vegetation or serpentine soils. We can also drill down even more in terms of slope, soil and other accessibility issues to kind of begin to think about the type of acreage that might be available for a given practice at a county scale that could be included in the climate action plan. So when we did this analysis for Santa Clara, you can see we gamed out a number of different regenerative ag practices, estimating the potential acreage, and then using either Comet Planner or local data. Like in the case of Oak Woodland, we actually used local research data to then estimate the type of carbon sequestration and mitigation benefits you could have at a county level. Now, clearly, this is total potential if you can engage those acres, but it starts to give us at least an outward boundary of thinking where there's potential to do this work. We did similar analysis in Marin County, looking at a range of agricultural land uses and practices here, and started estimating what the potential was in Marin County over time. And again, this analysis is not only refined by climate and ecological factors and on-farm factors, but importantly, we're engaging not only farmers and ranchers, but local level experts, practitioners, ecologists, and helping refine these numbers. So the important piece I want to talk about is when we do planning, it's important that we engage the stakeholders that are part of these counties in this conversation to sort of go from high level potential to like, what can we do and what we're excited about actually employing in terms of working lands. And then just so you know, Marin County just passed its cap, and this is actually an excerpt from the ag chapter where you can see regenerative ag, carbon farming is actually a significant part of the county's climate mitigation effort. So we have carbon farming and manure management. We also have urban sequestration. So we can think about urban gardens and urban forestry as part of this too. We didn't get to it, but we can also talk about wetlands and other natural systems also playing a role in carbon drawdown. So just to end here, some of the key levers, more important things to think about in terms of scaling up this work at a local level. Just like energy and other climate sectors, there's a large upfront cost to these practices, planning and cost. And then the payback or the long-term impacts are more long-term. So we do have a mismatch, just like in solar and energy efficiency, about the cost up front and then how we're going to pay these back. So there is a financial challenge here that we need to think about. Working lands means we actually have to manage these lands. And so we need to have carbon farmers or regenerative ag farmers, but they also need technical support. We need boots on the ground, people who can work with farmers that are trusted, that can kind of bring this kind of technical savvy and information and help monitor and do long-term work. So we really need to think about the labor side of this. And the one thing I also like to say, even if we had a robust goal for like want to do reforestry, we don't actually have the plant material to do this at scale. So we also need to think about the types of natural infrastructure like plant material that we would actually need to do this at scale. So it's both labor, technical assistance, and the infrastructure to support projects on the ground. And the last thing, and it's just a smattering of things that have come up in our conversations doing local climate planning around working lands. Another piece of it is there's a huge cost with a lot of the project approvals and permitting. I'm not saying we want to get rid of those, but in cases where there are clear environmental and climate benefits, talking about some level of streamlining to reduce some of the overhead costs for these projects. And I just put a link down here for Sonoma County's carbon sequestration effort. There was basically a new plan in Sonoma County where we're talking about scaling up working land strategies. That would be, I think, very insightful if you wanted to kind of dig more into that. Just wanted to end here, as when you talked about, there are local partners to you in most counties. We're working in nearly 40 counties, developing carbon farm plans with a range of partners, resource conservation districts, land trusts, UC Cooperative Extension, Autobond. There's a whole host of partners across the state that are doing this work. And for our part, we're building some regional hubs around regenerative ag to kind of begin to scale and share resources to scale the work. So just wanted to let you know that's out there as well. So I will end there. Sorry, that was a little long.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Tori and Wendy. I know there's, the work that you guys are doing is so inspiring, and we also know that there's a lot more work to do. Speaking of inspiring, there are a lot of questions. I had a few that I was going to start off with, but I liked this one question that maybe I thought I would start it off with. So Zeno asked, if regenerative ag has all of these upsides, why is it not picking up more quickly? Like, what are some of the barriers, and why does it need implementation subsidies? I don't know which one of you want to start with that.
Tori, you want to go?
Sure. I guess I would say two things. I wouldn't say, I think there are farmers out there that are doing this work. But if we're going to scale it, at least from my perspective, to significantly reduce climate mitigation, I feel that the additional cost for producers to do that, the lag between somebody implementing a practice and seeing an on-farm economic benefit could be several years. But I think there's a real public benefit and costs that ranchers are feeling, and so I think there are on-farm economics that work. I think there are some incentives, but in many cases, it still doesn't actually pencil out for producers to do this work solely out of their own pocket. But I think over time, as this scales up and it scales, I think it will actually, producers will take it on and the cost will actually reduce over time. I just think for a lot of farmers who are starting out this way, there isn't a huge incentive for them to do this except for the on-farm productivity benefits. They're not getting increased price for the food. It's certainly not in the sort of mainstream ag economy that they're getting value out of these practices. So I think there's still a distance there that I think we need to bridge.
Sure. I imagine as, climate impacts increase, there might be more of an incentive, but for now, maybe there needs to be a bit of an incentive. Wendy, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say if people want to read more, there's a report that was recently funded by Patagonia. Jenny O'Connor's the author, and it looks at barriers to adoption of regenerative agriculture by U.S. farmers and ranchers. She interviewed about 150 people and went through a whole different bunch of categories of barriers, from policy to actually the social is a big, huge one. If you're talking to farmers and ranchers, it's a conservative business. It's a margin, it's a business where people don't make a lot of money already. So their tolerance for risk and for change is pretty low. And those of us who do it are usually the oddballs in our neighborhoods, and that's worldwide. So just changing from what you're doing is hard for humans, and that's a big piece of it. But there's all the other things too, and as Tori rightly pointed out, a lot around just the startup cost to get doing something different, especially if you've already invested in a mode to do whatever kind of farming and ranching you've been doing before.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on a carbon fee and dividend? Is that something that's come up with either of you?
I don't know if it's coming up specifically for agriculture. I think that's a broader topic. I mean, I think having some kind of financial mechanism that could provide, a value on carbon without the externalities of that from a justice point of view, and having some kind of dividend would be great. I do feel like our farmers tell us if you paid me to grow carbon, I would grow it, but that's not what I get paid for. So I feel like if a carbon fee and dividend could get us closer to that, that's fine. But I think we do need a robust discussion about how we put a value on land management. People aren't paid enough to work the land, and they're not paid enough for what they grow. And so I think we have to actually fundamentally change the economy that supports that. And if, I mean, carbon fee and dividend could be part of that, and structure the right way, I think at least farmers we work with would be really interested. And actually, frankly, on a local level, we talk about, you know, the kind of mitigation scale we're trying to get to. I mean, despite the conservativeness, farmers, if they're part of the solution, want to be part of it, but there is a real cost to it. Just like, you know, buying an EV or going to, you know, zero emission energy. I mean, there is a real cost to it that farmers will have a hard time, in most cases, making that difference up.
Yeah, and we had a few questions around, you know, if the expansion of, if carbon sequestration will require, you know, ag lands expanding into open space preserves, or if that is part of any of these plans. Is that something that has come up with either of your work at all, or with maybe with the 2030 goals for California?
I mean, I'll jump in for starters. I think on the grazing side of things, it comes up because a lot of the lands that we have managed as ranch lands in our state aren't managed as optimally as they could to sequester carbon, increase forage, hold more water. So there's a whole conversation going on about how we could do better for our grazing lands. That even, I mean, it might sound like heresy, but even on some of the state park lands, or, you know, what we call protected lands, they're not managed. And if they were managed historically as grazing lands, then the impact of a grazing animal, of disturbance, as whether it's fire or grazing, but some kind of ecological disturbance, helps to actually bring regrowth, and that's not happening so much on those lands. So that's the conversation there. In terms of croplands, what I've heard more is just what are the opportunities to transition lands into a place where they're doing these kind of practices, where they could do cover crops, they could do no-till. You know, even in the existing acreages they have would be tremendous change if you think about driving through the Central Valley and how many acres just sit open. And when those fields, you're driving by those fields that are just sitting with the bare dirt exposed, I mean, they could be photosynthesizing. They could have a winter crop in there in between seasons that actually is photosynthesizing, that's feeding the ecology in the soil, that's holding water. So we're missing a huge bunch of opportunities. They do cost, I mean, cost money for a farmer to apply cover crops. But if we really care about these benefits, then as Tori said, paying people to do that work of helping our climate is a small price to pay. And not just the climate, because it's going to help the water cycles. It's going to help everything.
Yeah, I think on the question of open space, I might be setting somebody off, but I actually don't think that's the debate. I think there may be some examples where open space is a question of could they be managed for regenerative ag, but when we start to game out the state, there's plenty of existing ag land that's not open space that we deployed would be the first shot. I don't think open space, and I know point raised has come up, but I think that's an important but not really in the main issue. I mean, it raises larger issues around how we want to manage our public resources, particularly national parks. But I think the bigger opportunity is all the existing land that's already zoned ag that frankly could be converted or is being, you know, not managed as well. I think that's more, I think, in the wheelhouse. And as somebody who's, you know, a conservationist and ecologist, I feel like that's really the opportunity. So for open space land, it's already supposed to be ag. Like, that's an interesting debate and conversation about how do we bring appropriate regenerative ag to that. But I also want to remind people that this isn't sort of willy-nilly putting practices on, at least from our perspective, on the landscape. It actually comes with a conservation and ecological approach. So can't talk about the National Park Service and what they're doing, but what we do is an intense long-term engagement with the landowner to improve their system. I think we should all be supportive of that approach on managed land, not natural lands or wilderness, but on managed land. I think we actually do need more focus on the conservation outcomes. And so I feel like there's a huge upside here on this discussion that sometimes gets missed in the fight over the important other issues and geographies. But that's my perspective. A lot more upside with the ag we already have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, really well put. And I really, appreciate everyone's ideas and everyone's questions. I wish we could have gotten to more questions today. We are out of time, but I would like to take a few moments, if it's okay, to end on an inspiring note and ask both panelists, what are you most excited about related to carbon sequestration, and what do you see on the horizon? And maybe we'll start with Wendy.
Definitely excited about the governor's executive order and the opportunity that sort of points a finger for all of us who are doing this work to really think more pointedly about, there's so many issues to pay attentive to in the world, but if we all put our energy into figuring out, as Tori said, how we can apply these principles to the landscape and really manage for landscape health and ecological processes. I've seen the stories of hope around the world. I really think we can make a huge difference for not just California.
Yeah. Tori?
There are many things that make me really excited. I think the main one, and I'm actually in New York right now, that I see is like, as I said, we're going to need a lot more people on the landscape managing, and I'll just keep it on ag land. I also think we could be doing more natural resource management. But for me, it's the next generation that's coming, wanting to do land management, wanting to farm, and then having this lens of climate, environmental justice intertwined in that. I feel like we're on the edge of the next agricultural revolution. And so for me, it's this ability to engage at a local level, to have that conversation about what we want it to be, and then engaging the totality of our communities in that discussion and then making it happen. Like, that's what I'm excited about. And I see it from California to a little county here in New York, Essex County, which is regenerating itself economically through agriculture. It's just, that's why I do the work,
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. And I agree. We're on the edge of, perhaps the next agricultural revolution. And we are out of time, but I would really like to thank Wendy and Tori so much for taking the time here to be with us today. I know that carbon sequestration is just one piece of the systems approach that we need to implement and respond to climate change. But it really is part of the work that we are doing within our strategic plan at Greenbelt Alliance. And we look forward to working with both Wendy and Tori in the future to make our Bay Area and the world more resilient. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. This was our last webinar in 2020, but we hope to see you at another webinar next year, or perhaps at an in-person event at some point in the distant future. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day and take care. Thanks again. Goodbye.